Thanks very much for hanging with this event to the end of the day. I'm sorry that Admiral Rogers or his deputy George Barnes couldn't be here. You know, if you've been paying attention to the news, you know they're pretty busy right now. And since I had the privilege of working with George on the speech and with Admiral Rogers and his staff, you know, when they couldn't come, you guys got me. But hey, I have 29 years in information assurance and cybersecurity, and I have been doing a great deal in the last year looking at Internet of Things and cyber-physical systems. So we thought this was a reasonable match for this audience. Okay? So, I'm very happy to have this opportunity because this is an area that I think is extremely important that we think about. And I'll get to some reasons why I think that in a minute. I started my career at NSA in 1988, and the threat landscape back then was very different, right? You know, we had this threat from the Soviet Union, and they were after our military communications, right? So, you know, my job was at that time was to build software tools to assist the cryptographers who evaluated the cryptography in our military radios and network encryptors and things of that nature, because that was the threat we perceived at that time. Talk about a difference, right? It is, and it's been fascinating being in this career field the entire time and kind of watching it change. The threat landscape is always changing, right? There's no point at which we look and say, yeah, it's probably stable for the next 5, we can relax. Doesn't really work like that, right? So we are continuously having to think about adapting our approaches to defense, our approaches to hardening our systems, to detecting and preventing and responding to intrusions and attacks of various kinds. And now we're in a situation where cyberspace, right, and the internet used to be kind of off by itself, right? And it was over here, and you did your email there, and you looked at cat videos there, right? And then you had this other space that was the physical space, where you did things like drove on a highway and generated electricity and managed wastewater and things of that nature. And those spaces are merging, right? They're not separate anymore. They haven't been separate in quite some time. I was at a critical infrastructure workshop in the city of Seattle in the late 90s when this kind of stuff was just starting to get to be a big deal. And the level of naivete at that time in the late 90s was astounding. One of the folks from their electricity sector said he was sure that their systems were okay because the data links between the substations all ran over electric company-owned land. And I said, okay, this guy is thinking in a physical threat model. So, and, you know, I don't mean to make fun of that guy. There were a lot of naive people, including me, back in the late 90s. The internet, of course, has evolved rapidly. I won't kind of bore you with that evolution. But the key thing I want to bring up is as the internet was evolving through the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, there was a parallel evolution in digitized control systems, stuff that we today would call SCADA or industrial control systems. And that evolution was sort of happening, to those of us who are more in the sort of IT side, was happening in kind of off separately, and it developed and it became ubiquitous and it was used throughout our industry and critical infrastructure. And then maybe, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, they started connecting. And at first, they were connecting a little bit, and they were connecting more. And today, they're connected, you know, I don't know, like this, completely, comprehensively, something like that. And that makes a big difference. Because when your industrial control systems that are monitoring the traffic over your city were off on their own networks, and there were very, very few touch points to publicly accessible networks or to the global telecom system, then it was much easier to detect anomalies or to prevent traffic and what have you, right? And that's what people did back in the 90s, and it worked reasonably well. that's not how it works today. Business goals won't let it work like that today, right? Our modern business models and managing our infrastructures demand that our business systems and our customer-facing systems and financial systems and so forth are all interconnected. So that has opened up the threat picture so that anyone with a modicum of experience and a few tools downloaded from the internet can pose a great deal of risk to a lot of these systems, okay? Barriers to entry are low. Potential rewards are very high if you can come up with a good monetization model. And skills are lower. These sorts of crimes are also very difficult to deter because attribution is extremely difficult and consequences, even when an actor is attributed, today are currently low. And I know there are lots of folks working on that. I've spoken to folks at FBI and a lot of other agencies. We're not idle on that front, but at the moment, it's still, deterrence is very difficult to achieve. Now, NSA, you may be wondering why would an NSA person be speaking to you? Because NSA doesn't have direct governmental authorities over any particular critical infrastructures. We're not a sector-specific agency for any of the designated sectors. The couple of reasons why I'm here and why we study this stuff at NSA. The first one is quite simple. We do have the mission to protect and defend national security systems, and many national security systems have a critical infrastructure component. Think about it. Every Army and Navy and Air Force base is like a small town. It's got, power systems and water systems and all the rest of those things that a town would have. And I'm sort of thinking in this mode because I was at a Smart Cities Summit yesterday, and so I kind of still have this city infrastructure model stuck in my head from all the talks I attended yesterday. So NSA lives in cyberspace, right? Our mission for critical infrastructure, as well as our intelligence mission, requires that we live there. We've been living there a long time. We understand these technologies deeply, and it is within our authorities to extend technical assistance to any other federal agency that requests it of us. And we've had requests, and we've offered assistance to a lot of other federal agencies in a variety of these spaces. And I better hurry up or I'm not going to get through this stuff. Okay, I just love this topic so much, I'm getting sidetracked. Okay, so NSA is uniquely positioned, I think, to assist here in a variety of ways, even if we don't have direct governmental authority for like a particular sector. So I'm going to get into the meat here by talking first about a few evolutions of threat, okay? And the first one is sort of straight up criminal activity that's been on the rise. I have to give the criminals some degree of credit for being very creative in coming up with monetization models for their capabilities, right? In the end, that's what nearly all criminals are after, is some way of turning their malicious deeds into cash. And we have a lot of examples of activity that have either been directed against critical infrastructure sectors or have accidentally hit them as a side effect of hitting something else. Financial sector, probably the most immediate target. That's kind of one of those, why do you hit a bank? It's where the money is. If that's financial sector, that's where the money is. So cyber criminals have been going after banks and financial institutions for a very long time. But they're not alone anymore, right? Other critical infrastructure sectors are being hit. So we can see hackers holding systems for ransom or disrupting something and then trying to extort money through threat of further disruption. And that's pretty well understood. The next angle of the threat is as these systems become more and more integrated with various sort of physical aspects of our world, and this extends beyond critical infrastructure to sort of all aspects of Internet of Things, the cyber threat actors see a greater possibility, a greater potential to extend their malicious deeds from the cyber world to the physical world, right? and that allows them other new monetization models. But it also allows the third threat here, which is we're seeing an increased willingness by nation-state actors, at least right now, maybe more actors in the future, to apply cyber mechanisms to attempt to satisfy new types of goals. Right? They're not just going after monetary goals or intellectual property kind of goals. They're going after geopolitical goals. Right? We're starting to see that. And there's all sorts of ways to carry that out, to try to extend the influence of one's ideology through cyberspace, or to undertake punitive measures against those who've made them angry. We're starting to see that stuff happening. And you put these all together, and we have, unfortunately, a perfect storm of risk against our critical infrastructures. So that's why I think it's exceptionally important that those of us who work in that area, whether from the government side or the critical infrastructure operator side or the security and technology provider side, that we think about these things and that we work together as a community to address them. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to skip a bit of this review material here. Okay. There's a lot of aspects to this, right? There's hardening our systems, there's having good security practices and having good OPSEC. All of those are important. And they're especially becoming important because of the interdependence of these different sectors. Right? And every time we attempt an analysis like this, sort of within the defense community, we end up sort of walking things back and ending up at critical dependencies on things like telecom, power, water, financial, transportation. So without those things, we couldn't conduct the national security operations that are sort of the reason for being for my primary customers. And that extends to the rest of, I guess, our economy as well. Every business sector is going to have these same dependencies. So operational security practices are extremely important. And those OPSEC practices are very important, not just in your IT side, but in what we might call the OT side, right? The operations technology. I've talked to some operators that are working hard and investing hard in security in their IT, but they don't necessarily think about how to extend that over into the OT domain, and you really need both. Why? Because of one of the key messages I'm here to convey, and I'm sure it says somewhere on this page, key message, don't forget to say this, is trust relationships. Okay? That is a key thing that malicious actors pursue today. And we've seen this over and over again when we've analyzed various intrusions or conducted intelligence analysis of various threat actors, is that they're looking for those trust relationships. So if you have a trust relationship between your operations technology side of a business and the IT side of the business, threat actors are going to go after that. If they can get into one, they'll use that trust relationship to get over to the other. Another good one is if you have trust relationships within the parts of your network, that facilitates lateral movement by these threat actors. Okay, and we'll get to topics like segmentation in just a bit. Historically, and this sort of relates back to that little anecdote about a power company in Seattle, we've adopted an analog to physical security models for a lot of our networks, and you still see this a lot today in some critical infrastructure sectors. A very, kind of what I would call a little bit old-fashioned perimeter model, right? I have my good stuff, my crown jewels over here, and I have a perimeter around them, and I defend at the perimeter, and therefore my stuff on the inside is safe, right? And That's not an effective strategy anymore. Maybe it was 10 or 20 years ago, but it's not effective now. And the reason is those trust relationships. You have trust relationships that cross those boundaries all the time. And there's all sorts of them, right? There's encrypted channels that are poking right through that perimeter. There's transactions that are allowed to be conducted across the perimeter or control mechanisms that cross that perimeter. So it's no longer enough to simply think of, my stuff versus the rest of the world, and there's a nice perimeter in between. You need to think about, the stuff that is critical to my business, the trust relationships that extend into that critical structure, and how I'm controlling what can be conducted over each of those trust relationships. That's a very important model. I made this joke at the Smart Cities Summit the other day. Didn't get a laugh. We'll see if it works here. I recommended to the sort of room full of academics and municipal government officials who were studying smart cities, I said, you really need to know what those trust relationships are, write them down, and understand how each of them can affect your smart cities operations. And I said, if you think that writing down all your trust relationships is too burdensome, then you probably have too many of them. It didn't really work here either. But it's true, right? If you think, oh man, I have hundreds and hundreds of I can't write them all down. That's a problem, right? If you don't know where they all are, then attackers will find them and they'll exploit them, okay? So it's important to know what those are, and if they aren't absolutely necessary, cut them off, limit them, constrain them, right? I'm not saying don't have trust relationships allow you to run your business. You have to have that. But have the ones that are essential to the business, and if there are ones that are less essential, less important, less timely, run them through some kind of gateway, monitor them, constrain them, okay? Another area that is very important is out-of-date systems. We see a lot of issues with that lately. It's very difficult in some business contexts to keep systems up to date. This is certainly an area that we face in the Department of Defense as well. It's very difficult to update certain programs of record or equipment that has to serve for a very long time, like a spacecraft or a Navy ship. So sometimes you can't update stuff. First thing is update it if you possibly can. Right? Keeping things up to date is incredibly effective at keeping a lot of actors out. But if you can't, then think about how can I structure my network to reduce the impact from those things, all right? To isolate them, to constrain their activities, back to trust relationships. If that system over there is hideously out of date, maybe I don't want to trust it too much, okay? Same applies to Internet of Things. There are a lot of product categories within the Internet of Things today where security is currently very immature. I'm trying to there's a note on here, be diplomatic. Okay, so being diplomatic. Security is very immature, and that, if something is insecure, it can't be secured, can't be hardened, then you have to be very careful how much you trust it to do, okay? Said that already. Good. Okay. Another area, and this is something we've been looking at a lot in the Department of Defense lately, is recoverability and survivability. Okay? We all do the simple stuff of backing up our data, and that's essential. What a lot of people never test out is how well they can recover that data and actually bring it back into their environment in such a way that they can restart the business processes or operational processes that data drives, okay? So taking a lesson from the military side, you really want to do exercises with this stuff. You want to say, okay, I'm going to go through just like holding a COOP exercise or something like that. I'm going to say, I'm going to pretend that my data has been, wiped by a hacker, and I'm going to go through the exercise of restoring it from backup and restarting the business processes that depend upon it, and see if you can do it. I was in one program in government, this was probably a decade or more ago, where we ran into that as an accident. We lost some data. It wasn't catastrophic, but we found the backup restore system didn't work, and we couldn't get it back. Well, I'm glad that happened when it was something not critical and that we could easily say, oh, okay, we lost a little data. And then we fixed it, right? So that we could restore from backups more effectively. And that's one of those things that you don't really realize whether it works or not until you actually try it. The same is true of other response procedures. If we look at the example of the attacks on the power grid in Ukraine, very interesting example, has a lot of relevance for this community. One of the things they still had, as I understand it from reading the reports, was they still had folks that understood how to do manual operations. Okay? And so when necessary, when the cyber side of their business had been so damaged or was still under attack, denial of service attack, so they couldn't conduct operations remotely, they were actually send guys out on trucks, and they were still able to do that. That is something that we have to think about for the highest risk or most critical elements of our own critical infrastructures. Not saying you can necessarily do that for absolutely everything, but for the really critical stuff, you want to still have that capability and you want to exercise it. Okay? One other thing I needed to mention, because this one's important, is a lot of times you may have a setup where a machine, a control system, an HMI manager system, can't take a dangerous action on its own. Okay, right? It can't shut down an important process or something autonomously. So, okay, if you can't get a cyber vulnerable system to flip a switch for you or close a valve for you, your cyber attacker is going to be thinking, okay, how can I deceive the operator into doing that for me, right? And this is an important data integrity issue. It came up in the roundtable I was at briefly in the last session. Integrity of the data is important too, right? And I want to get this right, because this is basically deception, right? If someone can attack your system and cause the display to show, for example, the operator, that there is a hazardous condition at, let's pick on the chemical industry. So a hazardous condition at a refinery, the operator may be obligated by safety regulations to shut it down. Now, he'll shut it down. He'll shut it down safely. That's good. But it's tremendous business disruption that didn't need to occur because the deception occurred, right? Okay. Now I'm going to get to the sort of bold proposals piece. And I've said this in other public engagements. We have a situation in the United States where in many industry sectors, and the critical infrastructure sectors are no exception, we have a large number of companies of varying sizes, from just giant, enormous ones to smaller ones, that all face these cyber threats, right? And the situation we're in today, in large part, not totally, but in large part, each of those entities is responsible for their own defense, okay? And the same is true within government. Government's not immune, right? Every agency, every military service, right, responsible for their own defense. And DoD, we have some degree of centralization that we've worked hard to achieve. But what we need in our cyber defense environment is the ability to create shared visibility and coordinated response, okay? A situation where attacks against any part of our community are visible to the community, that tradecraft that malicious actor has spent their resources to create becomes visible not just to their one victim, if that victim happens to notice it, but to the entire community, right? Part of this is about deterring threat actors by reducing their ROI, right? If they get to use tradecraft against company A and B and C and D as many times as they like, once each, I suppose, then they get a great ROI. If they get to use it once, and the first time we catch them, we get countermeasures out to everybody in that sector or that vertical, there goes their ROI. That's part of the vision here, okay? In order to do that, we need to have appropriate sharing of data. We need to have clearinghouses and mechanisms to analyze that data, and then mechanisms to get the results of that analysis back out to the stakeholders who need it. Okay, and there's government stakeholders and private sector and so forth. And but beyond that, information sharing, right? DHS, I know, is putting tremendous effort into that area, as I'm sure Jeanette would have mentioned this morning. And we support those efforts, right? We're right there alongside DHS in integrated active cyber defense, if I got that acronym right. We had a similar program called ACD, Active Cyber Defense. We now just kind of use their name. But just sharing information is a great start, but it's not enough. We need to get to a model where we're sharing information and then we're sharing the results of analyses and tradecraft and countermeasures. Okay? For example, most people here have probably heard of the threat interchange format STIX, right? Some people have heard of that? Okay. And that's absolutely essential. We have to have that. The next step beyond that is a means to convey courses of action and defensive measures. And I'm in an industry government consortium that's working on that. DHS is in it as well, called OpenC2. And we have a spec document, and it's going forward for standardization very shortly. And that will allow us, or it's a start towards allowing us, to be able to, one entity in the community, let's say it's DHS, they analyze some tradecraft, they come up with an effective countermeasure, they can send that out machine speed to all the stakeholders who need it. That's up to that recipient, how they wish to apply it. But I think it's this sort of thing, the ability to send out a STIX characterization of attack and an associated OpenC2 characterization of countermeasure, will be very important towards enabling, especially these smaller companies, as one of the panels earlier said, who don't have their own security staff and their own team of cyber defense analysts and so on and so forth. Okay? So I think that that concept, you know, shared visibility, coordinated response, is going to be extremely important. And achieving that vision is going to require a lot of teaming between different industry sectors, industry and government, academia. It's going to be a big job, and there's kind of a role for everybody. I'd also like to mention, just in passing, a few of the areas where NSA has been trying to engage the community more heavily. You know, NSA, DHS, and FBI published 7 steps to effectively defend industrial control systems. That's based on actual analysis of incidents that occurred throughout 2015. NSA, this is the tricky part. There's so many sectors, right? It's very difficult. There's standards bodies and consortia occurring in every sector, but we are trying to selectively engage. So we joined the International Society of Automation Standards Committee, ISA 99, and we're integral to working on their standard 62443, which is technical security requirements for components of these automation systems. We're developing implementable cybersecurity standards for industrial control systems which support national security systems, right, because that's our authorities. But that document will be published publicly and will be available to help secure any type of industrial control system. Okay? And finally, we very heavily support DOE and NERC in their analysis of incidents and their work to draft security practices and standards. And of course, Jeanette would have mentioned this new executive order that came out. There are several critical infrastructure tasks in there, and we're gearing up. We already have individuals assigned to support those activities as subject matter experts. So I'm just about out of time, but I did want to try to leave time for questions. So, yeah, I think I hit all that. So let me just finish up. In this world that we're living in, where technology is changing, threats are changing all the time, and yet we have this strong social and economic imperative to utilize these technologies for our benefit, to improve our services and to make our cities smarter and all those things. We have to partner to improve their cybersecurity and their cyber defense. So that's it for my prepared remarks, and I'm happy to take questions if there's time. And there's a microphone over there if anybody has a question.
We haven't done any Q&A today. So
really? I could ask you guys questions. I love asking questions.
Hi, Neal. David Winks with ICIT.
Yeah, thanks for starting us off.
As you look at new technologies to bring in and evaluate, is one of the leading criteria the ROI and reducing that for the attackers? Or what are the metrics that you use to evaluate new technologies?
Yeah, that's a good question. We certainly do spend a lot of effort evaluating new technologies. The ability of a technology to reduce utility for the attacker is something we're using a great deal more, right? We have a framework for doing that under the NASCAR initiative, right? Which is, if you're sort of in the public sector, the closest analog would be MITRE's attack framework. It's a really nice conceptual model that MITRE has thrown together there. You can see it on the net. So we think about what are the different types of tradecraft adversaries apply at different steps of sort of the cyber kill chain, and then how can a given technology or practice or standard defeat different types of tradecraft. And then more specifically, we look at where do we have gaps today, what are the types of tradecraft that we can't effectively combat, and then we look very closely at the things that can fill those gaps. So good question. Okay, okay, back there. I'm sorry my answers aren't quite as entertaining as Admiral Rogers's would be. He's a really good speaker.
Thank you. Do you categorize physical security systems different from other operational technologies such as SCADA systems, building automation systems, which are environment control, because of their specific security posture mission? A lot of times I see them lumped in with OT, and they really have a more specific function that you really can't mix the two.
Yeah, that's a fair point, and I shouldn't mix them. I'm sorry if in my haste I mixed things that were not the same. We do look carefully at what I might call the subset of cyber-physical systems that are the physical security systems, things that control building access and gates and detectors, all those sorts of access systems, swipes, all those sorts of things. Yes, we look carefully at those. But I think as a general case for each of these types of if I can broadly say cyber-physical systems, there's different requirements. That was really brought home to me yesterday at this Smart Cities thing, where they had a panel of mayors, and every one of them was talking about how they wanted to take the data about their city and make it openly available to the entire internet. And I'm a DoD guy, right? No, you don't make data accessible to the whole internet, but that's their model, right? And so you really need to think carefully about what are the security requirements, the threats, the risks, the countermeasures that you apply in each sort of sector, and they're going to differ a great deal. The requirements for a sort of cyber-connected building access system are very different than the security requirements for a wastewater, stormwater management system, right? Integrity, confidentiality, fail closed, fail open. Unfortunately, there's no silver bullet. They each need to be analyzed on a case-by-case basis. But there are certain security principles that apply to all of them, and we do attempt to know, kind of elicit those, pull those out. Things like identity authentication, least privilege apply to all of those. Okay? All right,
hey, Neal, I think I have the last question because Parham's about to rescue you, but this will be a good one. I understand you've been doing this now since the Cold War.
Yeah.
So you've gone through a lot of software analysis over the years. And we had a presentation this morning. One of the panels brought up this whole concept of a cyber UL, right? Underwriter's Lab. I want to get your perspective on that. Is it realistic in the software industry to strive for something like that? And how would that work with the equities process?
So the concept of a cyber UL or some form of assurance of best practice as an aspect of liability or underwriting has come up many times. It would be very difficult to do it in a complete or comprehensive fashion, but my personal feeling is that it could be done in certain sectors, right? If you just said software as a whole, I think it's too broad. It would be difficult to find enough common principles that you could actually test things against them and then, regulate or adjudicate liability on that basis. But if you could pick a few, I guess you'd say somewhat narrower areas, maybe access control systems or network management systems, pick some. And an analog to that, or not a perfect analog, would be the way we handle protection profiles under the common criteria, right? That is for individual devices in most cases, or individual components, but you could have a similar role where a community of experts, providers, consumers, et cetera, come together, set some minimal requirements and a set of ways of testing them, because that's really important. You don't want to have requirements that you can't test. And then be able to get that industry sector to agree, yeah, we're all going to go with this, and because still now, if everybody goes with it, it's a level playing field, right? I think that's doable, but it could only work if these, both the providers and the consumers of those technologies want to make it work. All right? Okay.
Last question. All right, thanks, Parham. So I was struck by one thing you mentioned, and you talked about trust relations and how important it is to keep those somewhat limited. So I started to think about how do you go about cutting the relations without causing harm? So, and then as I'm thinking about that, I remember a line from The Godfather, right? Keep your friends close, but your enemies closer. So I'm kind of wondering, if you have some strategies around that.
I do a little bit. I mean, it's not an easy job, right? If it was easy, we would do it already. The first thing is there are many cases, if you look carefully around your environment, where you're unknowingly extending blanket trust. And you still see that a lot today, much less than you used to, but you still see it, where just ability to communicate on a network grants you certain trust, right? Certain systems will give you information just because you had the ability to send them a query packet, right? So you got to look at those and say, is that really what I want? Do I want anybody who has the ability to hop on this wireless access point to be able to query my customer database? Maybe you don't. So that's sort of about explicitly saying, I'm going to control access to my customer database. And maybe I give it to all my employees, but I don't give it to non-employees, okay? So that's the first part. Second part is you don't necessarily want to have direct trust. Sometimes you need to make it indirect in order to apply policy constraints or apply monitoring. So you might say, okay, I need to work with this business partner over here, but I'm not going to give them direct access to my HMI that's controlling my process control systems. I'm going to make them go through a service gateway where I can inspect their queries and regulate them. Maybe they're allowed to query my system, but they're not allowed to give it commands and tell it what to do. You can have a gateway or proxy or various other names you could use. So you don't have a direct trust relationship. Now you have an indirect trust relationship with the ability to enforce policy. And then lastly, you can look at your business processes and say, well, how am I conducting this business process? Is this trust relationship necessary, or could I accomplish it some other way, especially if it's something where the exposure is very great or the data involved is extremely critical, right? And if you go through the NIST cybersecurity risk management framework, you'll have to identify all those things. And say, okay, this risk is so critical, so grave, that I'm going to do this business process some other way. So sort of the three levels. Okay? All right.